Centuries ago, beyond deserts and mountains, there stood a kingdom that seemed eternal. Its walls were carved from black stone. Its banners carried symbols of fire and gold. The people called it the Empire of Shadows, not because the land was dark, but because its rulers cast long shadows of fear over every soul who lived there. The empire was rich. Its markets overflowed with jewels, spices, and silver. Warriors in shining armor marched through the streets, and temples glittered with offerings. To an outsider, it was paradise. But to those who lived under its crown, it was a prison built on silence and obedience. For generations, one family had ruled this land with an iron grip. Their bloodline was considered sacred, almost divine. Priests declared, "The throne is not chosen by men, it flows in their veins." And so, the people believed that as long as the royal blood remained unbroken, the kingdom would never fall. But time changes everything. Kings grow old, queens wither, enemies rise. And in the Empire of Shadows, the greatest fear was not war or famine, but the possibility of losing the pure bloodline. The rulers believed that if their royal blood ever mixed with outsiders, their divine strength would be weakened, their throne stolen, their power cursed. Every marriage, every birth, every choice of the royal family was watched with suspicious eyes, and so marriages were not about love. They were contracts. Daughters were promised to generals, sons were bound to princesses of neighboring lands. All for one purpose, to protect the throne. But one king and queen took this obsession further than any before them. At the heart of this tale stand two figures, a brother and a sister, born of the same mother, heirs of the same father. The prince was sharp like a blade, feared on the battlefield. He was ruthless, admired by soldiers, and whispered about by enemies. His very presence could silence a court. The princess was no less dangerous. She was intelligent, cunning, and beautiful, not in a gentle way, but in a way that commanded power. Courtiers described her as a rose with poisoned thorns. Together, they were the pride of their dynasty. But to their aging father, the old king, they were also a danger, because their bond was different, stronger, darker. The old king, weak and paranoid, feared what would happen when he died. Enemies circled the kingdom like vultures. Other royal families plotted to marry into their line, to steal what they called the divine blood. And so, advisors pressed the question, who will the princess marry? Who will secure the future? But the siblings had their own plans. They whispered to each other in the shadows of the palace. They dreamed not of love, not of alliances, but of a world where no outsider could touch their throne. The kingdom itself reflected this fear. In the streets, commoners told stories of curses that followed rulers who defied the gods. In the temples, priests warned, blood must not turn against blood, for nature punishes those who defy it. In the palace, walls were painted with scenes of war and conquest, reminding everyone that power came before morality. Children grew up hearing these tales. Mothers hushed their little ones with warnings. Obey the throne, for the throne is eternal. But what no one knew was that the throne was already cracking, not from outside enemies, but from the dark desire growing inside its own rulers. One night, during a royal feast, an old seer appeared at the gates of the palace. Blind, bent. With age, she cried out to the guards, "Tell your king, tell your children, when blood marries blood, the curse will be born in the womb, and the empire shall weep." The guards laughed, threw her into the streets, and the feast continued. But her words lingered in the minds of servants, scribes, and even the princess herself, because deep inside, she already knew. The path she and her brother desired was dangerous, unnatural, but unstoppable. As years passed, the old king's health declined, the siblings' power grew. Together they led armies, crushed rebellions, and ruled the court. People began to whisper, "They are more powerful than their father." But power always hungers for more. And for them, there was only one way to ensure no outsider could ever sit on their throne. They would take the crown, the bloodline, and each other. This was the beginning, a kingdom blinded by its obsession with purity, a dynasty so desperate to hold power that it was willing to defy the laws of gods and men alike. They believed their blood was their strength. But soon, their blood would become their curse. The kingdom waited for an answer. Who would the princess marry? Who would secure the royal bloodline? Courtiers whispered, generals debated, priests prayed. Every noble family sent secret letters, each hoping to bind themselves to the throne through marriage. But in the heart of the palace, behind golden doors and silent corridors, two siblings whispered to each other of a different fate. The prince and the princess, born of the same blood, bound not only by duty, but by a secret bond no one else could understand. One night, as torches burned low in the halls, the princess stood by her chamber window. The moonlight fell across her face, and her brother entered quietly. His armor still carried the dust of battle, his eyes burning with ambition. "They want me to marry a stranger," she whispered, "to share my throne, my blood, with someone unworthy." The prince stepped closer, his voice cold yet certain. "They want the throne divided. They want outsiders in our veins. But I will never allow it." For a long moment, silence hung between them, the kind of silence that changes destinies. Then the prince spoke again, with words that would echo through history. "If the throne must remain pure, then it can only remain between us. No outsider will ever touch our blood. You are my equal, my strength. You will be my queen." The princess trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of his words. She knew what he meant. She knew what it would mean for the kingdom, for the priests, for the laws of nature itself. Yet deep inside she felt the same burning fire. She wanted the throne, the power, the immortality of their bloodline. And in that fire, there was no room for morality. "But the people," she whispered. The prince's lips curled into a ruthless smile. "The people will bow as they always have. Their voices mean nothing. Their whispers will be drowned in our power. We are the blood of gods. No one dares challenge us." And in that moment, the decision was made. Brother and sister would wed. Not for love, not for desire, but for something darker. The obsession with eternal power. The palace felt it before it was spoken aloud. Servants noticed the long hours they spent together, the way they stood side by side in the court, the way their father's crown seemed to hover above them both. Rumors spread through the city like wildfire. In the markets, in the taverns, in the shadowy alleys, people whispered the unthinkable. "Have you heard? The prince and the princess. They plan to marry each other." Some laughed nervously, dismissing it as madness. Others shivered, remembering the warnings of the priests. Mothers clutched their children and muttered prayers against curses. In the temple's holy men raised their voices. "It is against the will of the gods. Blood cannot marry blood. Such a union will bring ruin." But their voices never reached the palace gates. The guards silenced dissent. The court scribes erased their words from the records, and the siblings, unshaken, continued their plan. The old king, weak and fading, tried to resist. In his chamber, he called his children before him. His voice cracked as he said, "This is not our way. The gods will punish such defiance. The people will rise against you." But the prince knelt beside his father's bed, his voice sharp as steel. "The people people rise only when they are allowed to rise. And the gods have chosen our blood. Do not mistake fear for wisdom, Father. Our dynasty will remain eternal, because we will never let it be broken." The princess stood beside him, her eyes calm, unyielding. She placed her hand on the king's arm. "Rest now, Father. Leave the throne to us. We will protect it better than anyone." The old man closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. He knew he had lost. The dynasty he had built with sword and fire would now be carried into darkness. Soon, preparations began in secret, not the joyous kind of preparations a kingdom expects for a royal wedding. No music filled the streets, no dancers performed in the markets. Instead, silence crept over the land. Fear settled in the hearts of the people, for they knew what was coming, yet they dared not speak against it. Inside the palace, golden robes were sewn, not with love, but with ambition. Priests were chosen not for their faith, but for their loyalty to the crown. In the deepest chambers of the temple, oaths were rewritten, twisted to justify the forbidden union. And then, one night, under the flickering light of 100 torches, the brother and sister stood before the altar. Their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a vow that was both powerful and cursed. The loyal priests recited the blessings, though their voices trembled. Outside the temple, thunder rolled in the sky as if the heavens themselves raged against them. The people dared not attend. They watched from afar, from rooftops and shadowed windows, whispering prayers to ward off the curse. And when the siblings were finally declared husband and wife, a chill swept across the kingdom, as though the earth itself had shuddered. The prince looked at his sister, now his queen, and whispered, "The throne is ours, forever." She smiled, but deep in her heart, a flicker of unease stirred. For though they had bound themselves together in power, the words of the seer still lingered in her memory. "When blood marries blood, the curse will be born in the womb," and somewhere in the darkness of the kingdom, that curse had already begun to breathe. The day of the wedding arrived, though no bells rang, no laughter echoed in the streets, and no songs filled the air. Unlike other royal marriages that bloomed with music and joy, this one was wrapped in silence. The kingdom watched from behind closed doors, from shuttered windows, from the shadows of temples. They knew the union was forbidden, unnatural, yet none dared to speak against it. Inside the palace, however, everything glittered with a haunting kind of beauty. Gold drapes hung from towering arches, candles flickered in endless rows, casting trembling shadows upon stone walls. The grand hall was filled with nobles dressed in silks, their faces painted with forced smiles. Their eyes darted nervously, as if afraid to look directly at the bride and groom. The princess entered first. She wore a gown woven from black and crimson threads, the colors of fire and blood. Jewels glittered on her crown, but her face was pale, unreadable. Her steps echoed across the hall, each one heavy with destiny. Behind her trailed maidens, silent and trembling, their eyes lowered as though they carried a secret shame. Then came the prince. Clad in armor polished to a mirror shine, a crimson cloak flowing from his shoulders, he walked with the confidence of a conqueror. His eyes burned like embers, daring anyone to question him. When he stood beside his sister, the air itself seemed to tighten, as though the walls of the palace knew the weight of their union. The high priests stepped forward, their hands shaking, as they unrolled ancient scrolls. Some of them had begged to be excused from this ceremony, whispering of curses and divine wrath. But the prince's guards had silenced them. Those who remained read the blessings with trembling voices, their words hollow and lifeless. Still not all remained silent. From the edges of the hall, an old priest cried out, his voice breaking through the silence. "This is no wedding," he shouted, his frail hands raised toward the heavens. "This is defiance against the gods. You bind yourselves not in holy matrimony but in curse. The skies will burn, and your children will suffer the punishment of this sin." The hall froze. Nobles gasped. Soldiers drew their swords, ready to cut him down. But the prince lifted his hand. He stared at the priest with cold disdain and said, "The throne is the will of the gods, and we are the throne. If the gods wish to punish us, let them try." With a nod, the old priest was dragged away, his cries echoing down the stone corridors until they faded into silence. The ceremony continued, but the words of warning still lingered in the minds of all who witnessed them. Outside the palace, the sky turned restless. Black clouds gathered over the kingdom, swirling as though stirred by unseen hands. A murder of crows circled above the temple towers, their caws harsh and relentless. Some servants whispered that each crow was a spirit, watching, waiting for the curse to unfold. The vows were spoken. The siblings clasped hands, their fingers entwined in a grip of power rather than affection. As they repeated the sacred words, thunder cracked across the heavens, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. Yet they did not falter. The prince's voice was steady, commanding, while the princess's voice was soft but sharp, like a dagger wrapped in silk. When the final blessing was uttered, a gust of wind burst through the hall, extinguishing half the candles. Darkness spread across the chamber for a moment before the flames reignited. Some whispered it was an omen. Others lowered their heads, pretending it was nothing. The celebration that followed was unlike any royal wedding before it. There was no music, only the pounding of war drums echoing across the courtyard. Dancers were absent. Instead, armored guards stood in every corner, their swords glinting in the firelight. The nobles drank wine, but it did not warm their hearts. Their laughter was thin, nervous, brittle like glass. As the night deepened, lightning flashed again and again outside the palace windows. Each strike illuminated the dark faces of the siblings, seated on twin thrones side by side, watching their court with unreadable expressions. They looked not like bride and groom, but like conquerors who had taken victory from the hands of gods themselves. And yet, for all their triumph, shadows whispered around them. The storm outside raged on, rain pelting against the palace walls, as though heaven itself wept for what had been done. In the silence between thunderclaps, the words of the old priest seemed to echo again. "Your children will suffer the punishment of this sin." The princess felt it most. As she raised her goblet, as she forced a smile, she felt the weight of those words sink into her chest. She remembered the night by the window when her brother had sworn to keep the throne pure. She remembered the blind seer's warning spoken years ago. And though she would never show her fear, a chill crawled down her spine. The prince, however, felt nothing but triumph. He stood lifting his cup, his voice booming through the hall. "Tonight, the bloodline remains unbroken. Tonight, we defy those who would see us divided. Let the world know, the throne is eternal, and so is our blood." The court cheered, though their voices were hollow, forced. Outside, the storm roared louder, lightning splitting the sky. A crow landed on the palace gate, its black eyes fixed on the temple where the siblings sat crowned in their cursed union. And so, the wedding ended not with joy but with fear. A wedding meant to seal their eternal rule became a night of omens. Firelight flickered like restless spirits, crows screamed into the night, and the storm raged on. As if the heavens themselves had sworn vengeance, the people would remember it forever. Not as a day of unity, but as the wedding of shadows. The night when brother and sister stood against the laws of nature, the warnings of priests, and the wrath of the skies themselves. What they did not know, not yet, was that the curse had already begun to take root. It would not strike them in that moment. No. The punishment was waiting, silent and patient, in the unborn children who would one day carry the weight of their defiance. The wedding of shadows had ended, but its echo lingered. The storm had passed. The crows had flown, yet the kingdom was never the same again. The people awoke to a new order, one in which fear reigned supreme and silence was the only form of loyalty. The siblings now ruled not as prince and princess, but as king and queen. Their crowns gleamed under torchlight, symbols of power that seemed untouchable. Together, they sat on twin thrones, watching over their trembling court. Their marriage had broken the laws of gods and men, yet to the eyes of the world, they looked invincible. And with each passing day, their illusion of power grew stronger. The new king proved himself ruthless in war. He rode with his armies across deserts and mountains, crushing rebellions, burning enemy banners to ash. He was like a storm on the battlefield, his sword striking with a fury that made men drop their weapons before his blade ever reached them. When he returned to the capital, the streets filled with silent processions, not cheers, not joy, only fear. The queen, meanwhile, ruled with a cunning hand. In the court, her voice was sharper than steel, her gaze cold as ice. She knew every whisper, every plot, every secret alliance. Nobles who dared to doubt her vanished overnight, their estates swallowed by the crown. Spies and informants wove her web tighter with each passing month, until no one in the kingdom could breathe without her knowing. Together, they built alliances that served only their throne. Neighboring rulers, terrified of their growing might, bent the knee. Tributes of gold and grain flowed into the empire, swelling its riches. Trade routes expanded, temples rose higher, armies grew stronger. The people saw their might and believed the siblings had triumphed not only over men, but over fate itself. They have defied the gods, whispered the merchants in hushed awe. And yet they are blessed. Perhaps they are gods themselves. Even the priests, once bold enough to curse them, now bent in silence. Their temples filled with offerings, their prayers twisted into words that pleased the crown. In every hall, the siblings' portraits were painted larger, grander, images of rulers who looked more like deities than mortals. But behind the gold, behind the banners and triumphs, something darker pulsed. The storm that had raged on their wedding night had not vanished. It had only gone quiet, like a predator watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Yet the siblings saw none of this. To them, every victory was proof of their eternal rule. They had ignored the priests, and still the temples stood. They had defied the heavens, and still the rains fell. The crops grew, the rivers flowed. Where was the punishment? Where was the curse? Night after night, they feasted in their grand hall, surrounded by nobles who smiled with empty eyes. Wine flowed like rivers, torches burned like suns, and music thundered from drums of war. The king raised his goblet, declaring to his people, "We have defeated destiny, we have silenced the gods." And the people cheered, not out of love, but out of fear. For in their hearts they remembered the seer's warning. They remembered the storm, the crows, the old priest's cries. They knew the curse would come, not in fire and thunder, but in something far more terrible, something that would grow quietly inside the very blood the siblings sought to protect. The queen, though victorious, sometimes felt the chill of doubt. In the solitude of her chambers, when the torches burned low, she would hear echoes in her mind. Your children will suffer, the curse will be born in the womb. But when she turned to her husband, his fire burned so fiercely that her doubts were drowned. He spoke only of conquest, of eternal legacy, of blood made divine through their defiance. And so, the illusion deepened. Their kingdom stretched its hand across distant lands, their coffers overflowed, their names were etched into stone as gods walking among men. Yet what they could not see, what they refused to see, was that their victories were shadows, illusions painted across a wall of fire. Because fate is patient. Curses do not strike when the blade is sharpest or the throne is strongest. No, curses wait for the moment when arrogance blinds the heart, when rulers believe themselves untouchable, and in that moment, destiny strikes with greater force than any army. The king and queen laughed at fate. They believed they had defeated it. But in truth, fate had only tightened its grip. Every cheer of their fearful subjects, every alliance, sworn in trembling hands, every battlefield victory. All of it was merely the silence before the storm. And in the queen's womb, beneath her jeweled robes and guarded secrets, the storm had already begun to grow. They thought themselves immortal. They thought their blood divine. But what they did not know was that blood is both strength and curse. And soon, the empire would learn that no throne, no crown, no illusion of power can stand against the weight of destiny. The palace had never shone so brightly. Golden lamps lined its corridors, musicians filled the air with triumphant notes, and the streets of the capital overflowed with color. The reason was simple: the queen was with child. When the announcement was made, the kingdom erupted in celebration. For years, whispers of curses and divine punishment had haunted the empire. But now, with the queen carrying an heir, those whispers were drowned beneath a wave of joy and relief. To the people, it was proof that the throne was blessed. That the gods had not turned their backs, that the bloodline, pure and unbroken, would continue. Everywhere, the news spread like wildfire. In the markets, merchants raised their cups in toasts. In the fields, farmers prayed for the unborn child's strength. In the temples, priests who had once spoken warnings now proclaimed blessings, declaring, "The dynasty will remain eternal. The throne is secure." But within the palace walls, the celebrations were even grander. Banquets stretched long into the night. Courtiers and generals showered the queen with gifts of gold, silk, and jewels. The king stood tall beside her, his eyes alight with pride and triumph. For him, this was not just a child, and it was proof that he had defeated destiny, that their forbidden union had not been cursed, but chosen. The queen sat upon her throne, her hands resting gently upon her growing belly. Servants brought her every luxury, every comfort, yet her mind was consumed not by silks or jewels, but by visions of the future. She imagined her child, strong, flawless, born of blood untouched by outsiders, a child destined to rule not only the empire, but perhaps the entire world. At night, when the feasts ended and the palace grew quiet, the siblings would speak in hushed tones. The king, his voice filled with fire, would whisper, "Our child will be the first of a dynasty, greater than any before. Born of pure blood, untouchable by men or gods. He will rule empires, conquer lands, and write his name into eternity." The queen would smile, her fingers tracing the curve of her belly. Or she whispered softly, "A daughter as fierce as her mother, as cunning as her father, a queen who bends nations to her will." And together, they dreamed of a future built upon this child, a perfect heir, the living embodiment of their defiance. But outside the glow of their dreams, shadows whispered. Among the common people, not everyone celebrated. In the corners of markets, old women muttered prayers of protection. In the temples, younger priests, braver than their elders, spoke cautiously of ancient laws, reminding their listeners that bloodline purity was a dangerous path. Children born of such unions, they warned, carry not blessings, but curses. Yet their voices were quickly silenced, for the king's spies were everywhere. Every whisper of doubt, every flicker of rebellion was crushed before it could grow. Fear held the kingdom tighter than ever. Still, omens appeared. On the night of the queen's 3rd month, a fire broke out in one of the great temples. Its statues crumbled to ash, its roof collapsed beneath the flames. The priests said it was an accident, but the people wondered, was it a sign? Another night, thunder shook the sky, though no storm was seen. Windows rattled, lamps flickered, and a flock of crows descended upon the palace gardens, their black wings blotting out the moon. Servants crossed themselves, whispering that the unborn child carried darkness within. Yet in the royal chambers, none of these signs mattered. The siblings were blind to omens. All they saw was the promise of power, the immortality of their bloodline. They wrapped themselves in illusions, refusing to believe anything could taint their legacy. The queen grew heavier with each passing month. Her body weakened, but her spirit burned with determination. She endured the endless ceremonies, the constant eyes watching her, the suffocating weight of expectation. Each night, she placed her hand upon her womb and whispered to her unborn child, "You will be perfect, you will be strong, you will be our eternity." The king, restless as ever, began to prepare for the child's arrival as though preparing for war. He had a cradle carved from the rarest ebony wood, lined with gold. He ordered new banners woven, bearing symbols of fire and crowns intertwined. A sign of the new dynasty his child would begin. He even commanded that a new throne be forged, smaller but gleaming, waiting for the day his son or daughter would sit beside him. The people were commanded to rejoice. Day after day, festivals filled the capital, though behind the forced smiles of dancers and the hollow laughter of nobles, there lingered unease. Some prayed for the unborn child's health. Others prayed for the child not to be born at all. But no one dared speak openly. The siblings' power was absolute, and now, with the queen's womb carrying the future, that power seemed eternal. The king and queen believed they had won, that their defiance had not been punished but rewarded, that their bloodline, once threatened by destiny, had been sealed forever in purity and strength. They looked at each other with triumph in their eyes, whispering of a future where their dynasty would last for centuries. They did not see the storm gathering behind the veil of their dreams. They did not hear the cries of fate echoing like distant thunder. They did not feel the weight of the curse growing silently within the queen's womb. For even as they dreamed of a perfect heir, destiny prepared to show them the truth, that no throne, no crown, no illusion of purity can protect against the price of defying nature. They dreamed of an heir who would make their empire eternal. They dreamed of a perfect child born of perfect blood. But what they could not see was that the child was already touched, not by the blessing of the gods, but by the curse of their own arrogance. The night arrived when destiny could no longer be delayed. The palace, usually blazing with torches and laughter, stood silent. Its towers loomed like black teeth against the stormy sky, while thunder rolled across the heavens. Rain lashed the marble courtyards, spilling through gutters like rivers of ice. Servants hurried through the halls, carrying bowls of water, cloths, and herbs, their faces pale with fear. The queen was in labor. Inside her chamber, the air was thick with smoke from burning incense. Curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the eyes of the world. Midwives moved like shadows, whispering prayers as they prepared their tools. Priests stood in the corners, their hands trembling over sacred scrolls. Some muttered blessings, others muttered curses, their voices low, as though afraid the unborn children might already hear them. The queen lay upon her bed, her face pale, her body trembling with the agony of childbirth. Sweat glistened on her brow as her cries echoed through the chamber, mingling with the thunder outside. Beside her, the king paced like a caged beast. His fists clenched, his eyes burning with a mix of fear and pride. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, had stood against armies without flinching, but now he felt powerless. A priest leaned close to another, whispering words not meant for royal ears. The seer was right. The curse is here. Blood has turned against blood. Another shushed him, but the words clung to the air like smoke. The queen screamed again, her voice breaking through the storm. The midwives urged her on, their hands working swiftly. Hours passed like years. Outside, lightning split the sky, each flash illuminating the palace towers in a ghostly glow. The storm refused to relent, as though the heavens themselves were at war with what was about to be born. Finally, a cry pierced the night. But it was not the cry of triumph. It was thin, fragile, broken. The first child had arrived. A midwife lifted the infant into the light, and her face drained of color. She did not speak at first, her hands trembling as she tried to cover the child with cloth. The king stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Show me my son." The midwife hesitated. The silence stretched until it broke under the weight of his fury. Slowly, she lowered the cloth. The court gasped. The child was alive, but twisted, fragile, marked by deformities that no words could conceal. His limbs bent strangely, his face carried shadows of suffering, his cry was weak and uneven. The queen turned her head, her eyes widening in horror. For months, she had dreamed of a perfect heir, a child born of pure blood, destined to rule. And now, before her, lay the cruel truth of their defiance. But the agony was not over. Her body trembled again, contractions tearing through her. Another child was coming. The midwives rushed to her side, urging her to push. Hours stretched again into eternity. The storm outside grew wilder, rain pounding like drums of war, thunder crashing as though the sky itself screamed. And then, another cry. The second child was born. The midwives looked upon the infant and despair filled their eyes. This one too was marked. Though different from the first, the signs of deformity were clear. His skin was pale, his body frail, his breath shallow. He shivered in their arms as though the very air was too heavy for him. Twins. Both cursed. Both fragile. Both living proof of what the seer had foretold. The priests fell to their knees, some in prayer, others in fear. One old priest whispered, "The gods have spoken. This is their punishment. This is the curse of broken laws." The queen, her strength fading, reached weakly for her children. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled them, one in each arm. Her body trembled not only from exhaustion, but from the unbearable weight of truth. These were her children, her blood, her legacy. Yet they were also the curse she had been warned of. The king stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning. With denial, he refused to see weakness. He refused to see deformity. To him, the children were heirs, born of his blood, and nothing else mattered. "They are mine," he growled. "They are ours, and they will rule." But even as he spoke, thunder cracked, so loudly that the walls of the palace shook. A candle toppled, its flames sputtering out. Shadows deepened across the chamber, as though the storm outside had crept in to claim its place. The queen rocked the infants gently, whispering through her tears, "My children, my poor children." One of the midwives, her hands trembling, dared to speak. "My king, my queen, they are alive, yes, but they are weak. Their bodies, they may not survive." The king's eyes blazed with fury. "Silence, they will live, they will thrive, they are royal blood." But the priests knew better, the servants knew better. Even the queen, deep in her heart, knew better. These children were not the saviors of the dynasty. They were the curse made flesh. Outside, the storm raged on. Crows screamed from the palace rooftops, their wings thrashing against the rain. The sky split again and again with lightning, as though the heavens themselves refused to let the night rest. And within the palace chamber, 2 infants cried, weak, broken cries that carried the weight of prophecy, the cries of children who should have been symbols of strength, but instead became symbols of tragedy. That night, the empire celebrated the birth of heirs. But what they could not see, what they dared not admit, was that destiny had already spoken. The twins were not blessings, they were curses in flesh. Proof that no throne, no crown, no blood, no defiance could escape the judgment of the heavens. The storm had passed, but the palace was still drowning in its shadow. The night of screams and thunder was over, yet silence hung in the corridors, like a suffocating veil. The royal chambers, once filled with celebration, now reeked of incense, blood, and fear. The queen lay weak, her arms clinging desperately to her newborn twins. Their cries were faint, their small, twisted forms wrapped tightly in silken cloth. She wept silently, her tears falling upon their fragile faces, as though her love alone could heal what nature had broken. The king stood near the window, his back turned to all. His fists gripped the stone ledge so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He stared at the rain-soaked courtyards below, refusing to look at the truth behind him. His empire had been promised perfection, strength, a dynasty of pure blood. And yet the heirs he had demanded were born frail, malformed, a reflection not of glory but of sin. Still, he could not, he would not, accept it. "They are not cursed," he muttered, his voice sharp as a blade. "They are mine. They are of royal blood, and the world will see them as nothing less." The midwives lowered their eyes, trembling. The priests who had witnessed the birth exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared challenge him. They knew the king's wrath. They had seen men executed for far lesser crimes than speaking the truth. The queen whispered weakly, her voice cracking under the weight of sorrow. "But the people will know. They will see." The king turned then, his eyes blazing. "They will see only what I allow them to see. Do you understand? This truth must never leave these walls. But secrets are fragile things, and the walls of a palace have ears." The servants who had witnessed the birth could not keep silent. They whispered in the kitchens, in the laundry halls, in the candle-lit corridors where shadows gathered. Fear kept their voices low, but fear also sharpened the urgency of their words. "They are not right," one maid whispered to another, her hands shaking as she scrubbed the floor. "The twins, they were born twisted." The other crossed herself, quickly glancing over her shoulder. "Do not say such things aloud, the king will have our heads." "But it is true," the maid pressed. "Their cries, they did not sound like the cries of normal children. It is a curse of their greed." Within days, the whispers seeped beyond the palace gates. A merchant heard them from a frightened guard. A priest carried them into the marketplace. A servant, careless with her tongue, repeated the tale to her family. And so, like wildfire, the story spread. The people, who only days ago had celebrated with feasts and songs, now spoke in hushed voices. "They married in defiance of the gods," said an old woman at the market stall, "and now the heavens have punished them." "They thought themselves above nature," muttered a farmer, shaking his head. "But blood cannot be purified by sin. Their children bear the mark of their arrogance." In the taverns, in the temples, on the dusty roads leading into the city, the same words were repeated again and again. "It is the curse of incest and greed." Back in the palace, the king fought desperately to contain the rumors. He commanded guards to silence anyone who spoke against the royal children. He threatened priests, bribed nobles, punished servants. But fear is not easily silenced. For every tongue cut out, 2 more whispered in the shadows. For every execution, 100 more believed the curse must be true. The queen, though broken, with grief, could not ignore what she heard. From her chambers, she caught the echoes of servants gossiping outside her door. She saw the way their eyes lingered upon her children, not with loyalty, but with pity, or worse, with disgust. She held her twins closer, her heart aching. They were her blood, her flesh, her children. To her, they were not curses, but fragile souls struggling to survive, yet even her love could not shield them from the weight of the kingdom's hatred. One evening, as she rocked the infants in her arms, a storm of voices rose from the courtyard below. A crowd had gathered, not to celebrate, but to murmur. Their words drifted up like smoke. "Cursed," they hissed. "The children are cursed." The queen turned to her husband, tears streaking her cheeks. "Listen to them. You cannot silence the whole world." The king's jaw tightened. "They are fools, blinded by fear. I will remind them who rules this land." But for the first time, his voice cracked beneath his anger. For the first time, the mask of control began to slip. In the days that followed, the palace grew colder. Guards doubled at every gate. Servants moved with downcast eyes, speaking little. Nobles who once filled the throne room with laughter now avoided court, fearful of being associated with the cursed dynasty, and always the children cried. Their weak, uneven wails echoed through the night, haunting the halls like ghosts. Some servants claimed the cries carried strange notes, not of life, but of sorrow, as though the infants themselves mourned their own birth. The priests, once forced into silence, began to speak again, not openly but in secret. In hidden corners of temples, they told the people that the dynasty's days were numbered, that the curse was not upon the children alone, but upon the entire throne, that the sins of the rulers would consume the empire itself. The king raged against it all, but rage could not undo what had been done. He could not rewrite the truth written in the bodies of his children. He could not command destiny to obey his will. And the queen, broken yet tender, whispered to her twins as she held them through the night. "You were born of love, but the world will only see the curse. Forgive us, my children. Forgive us." The birth of the twins should have secured the throne for centuries. Instead, it shattered the illusion of power. The palace, once a fortress of strength, became a cage of whispers. And outside its walls, the people repeated the words that would define the dynasty forever. It is the curse of incest and greed. The curse had taken root. At first, the palace tried to hide the truth. The king commanded silence, the queen shielded her children from prying eyes, and guards dragged dissenters into dungeons where no voices returned. But secrets are like cracks in stone. No matter how tightly one seals them, they spread. And this secret spread like fire across dry fields. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors turned into conviction, and conviction, once planted in the hearts of the people, turned into rebellion. The kingdom that had once celebrated the promise of heirs now spat upon their names. Farmers refused to bring offerings to the palace. Merchants stopped carving the royal crest into their wares. Priests once loyal to the throne began calling upon the gods to strip power from the cursed dynasty. In taverns, drunken voices shouted, what sober lips dared not. Why should we serve rulers who spit in the face of heaven? Their greed has doomed us all. The streets grew restless. Guards who once inspired fear now faced jeers, stones, and spit. Even the palace walls could no longer shield the siblings from the truth. Their people no longer revered them. They despised them. Enemies beyond the borders saw their chance. Neighboring rulers who had once bowed to the empire's might now sharpened their blades. They sent spies, then armies, moving like vultures drawn to the scent of a dying beast. The king, blind with pride, refused to see it. "They dare not challenge us," he roared in the throne room, his voice echoing across the empty marble floor. "We are chosen by blood. We are eternal." But even his generals looked away. They had seen the truth in the eyes of their soldiers. Men who once fought fiercely now hesitated, their loyalty corroded by fear of the curse. For who would bleed for rulers whom the heavens themselves had condemned? One by one, allies slipped away. The dukes of the Western Mountains pledged themselves to rival kings. The lords of the Eastern Seas withheld their tribute. Even blood relatives, cousins, uncles, distant kin, abandoned the throne they had once sworn to protect. Betrayal bled into the palace itself. Servants disappeared in the night, carrying secrets to the outside world. Guards whispered treachery in the barracks. Gold meant to fund armies vanished, stolen by those who no longer believed the dynasty would survive. The queen, trapped between grief and despair, saw it more clearly than her husband. She heard the whispers in the corridors, saw the fear in her servants' eyes, and knew what it meant. One night she said softly, "We are not feared anymore. We are hated. Even those who stand beside us are only waiting for our fall." But the king's pride was stronger than reason. His obsession with the bloodline consumed him. He held the twins up before the court, declaring, "These are my heirs. My blood is unbroken. The line will endure forever." The courtiers clapped because they had to, but in their eyes burned contempt. They no longer saw strength in the royal children, only weakness, only proof of sin. The palace feasts grew quieter, then vanished altogether. Where once halls had overflowed with nobles vying for favor, now they stood empty, echoing with loneliness. The dynasty that had seemed invincible was collapsing from within. Outside, rebellion grew bolder. Farmers refused to pay taxes. Villagers rose against the king's soldiers, ambushing patrols in the night. Entire towns declared themselves free from the throne's rule. Flames lit the horizon as banners of revolt rose higher each day. The king unleashed his wrath upon them. He sent armies to crush the rebellions, to burn villages, to slaughter those who dared defy him. For a moment, victory seemed possible, but the victories were hollow. For every village he burned, 3 more rose against him. For every rebel killed, 10 more took up arms, fueled not by fear but by vengeance. The queen pleaded with him, "Stop this madness. Every drop of blood you spill only strengthens their resolve. Can you not see? The curse is not just upon our children. It is upon us all." But he silenced her with fury. "No curse can defeat me. My blood is eternal. My dynasty will not fall." Yet even as he spoke, the cracks widened. The empire's armies grew smaller, defeated not only by enemies, but by desertion. Soldiers slipped away in the night, throwing down their weapons, choosing freedom over service to a cursed throne. Fortresses once loyal raised rival banners. Ships once carrying tribute now carried war. And within the palace itself, betrayal reached its peak. One by one, the king's most trusted advisors vanished. Some poisoned, some fled, some turned against him. In their place, shadows gathered. Men who smiled to his face but whispered rebellion behind his back. The twins, too young to understand, grew in the midst of this storm. Their cries echoed through the palace, weak and haunting, a constant reminder of the dynasty's shame. Servants avoided their nursery, crossing themselves when they passed the door. To the people, the children were not heirs but omens, embodiments of the curse that had brought ruin upon the land. The king clung to them obsessively. He paraded them through the halls, forcing his courtiers to bow before them. "Look upon my heirs," he demanded. "Look upon the future of the empire." But every bow was hollow, every eye filled with scorn. The queen, her spirit shattered, no longer argued. She simply watched the crumbling of all they had built, holding her children close as though her love could shield them from the hatred of the world. Yet even she knew the truth. Love cannot undo destiny. The empire, once vast and feared, now stood on the brink of collapse. The siblings who had believed themselves invincible, who had broken the laws of nature to preserve their bloodline, had instead destroyed everything. Their obsession with purity had not strengthened the throne. It had poisoned it. Their empire did not fall because of war alone. It fell because of arrogance, because of greed, because of an obsession with blood that blinded them to the truth. They believed their line would last forever. But blood, when tainted by sin, becomes not a crown, but a curse. The empire was falling apart, but within the palace walls a darker tragedy unfolded. The twins, once hailed as saviors of the dynasty, had become the shadows of its downfall. Their frail cries haunted the marble corridors, their twisted forms hidden behind curtains of silk. The king and queen could not bear to let the world see them, yet they could not bear to let them go. And so the children lived in secrecy, ghosts of a dynasty still clinging to the illusion of power. The king ordered a hidden wing of the palace sealed, its windows shuttered, its halls silenced. There the twins were kept away from prying eyes, tended only by a handful of servants sworn to silence under threat of death. Food, medicine, toys of gold, all were provided, but none of it masked the truth. The children were not symbols of strength. They were reminders of the curse. At night, their cries echoed through the stone walls, thin and broken, carrying like whispers into the darkest chambers. Servants crossing the halls swore they heard them even when the children slept. Ghostly, wails that chilled the blood. Some claimed the palace itself groaned with their sorrow, as though the very walls could not contain the weight of their existence. The queen visited often, holding her children close, rocking them with tears streaming down her face. She whispered lullabies, promises of love, words of comfort no one else would speak. To her, they were not monsters, not curses, but her blood, fragile, innocent, undeserving of the hatred cast upon them. But guilt gnawed at her soul. Each time she looked into their weak eyes, she saw the reflection of her own sin. She remembered the warnings, the priest's words, the omens ignored. And still, she had chosen love twisted into greed. The children, she knew, bore the punishment for choices that were not theirs. The king, however, could not endure the sight of them. He visited rarely, and when he did, his gaze was not one of love, but of rage and denial. He would pace before their cradles, declaring, "They are heirs, they are mine, they will rule." Yet his words rang hollow, empty echoes in a room filled with sorrow. For even he could not silence the truth in his heart. These children could never carry the empire. Paranoia grew in him like rot. He feared the servants might betray the secret. He feared the priests might curse the children further. He feared even his allies would use the twins as proof of his downfall. Each day his orders grew harsher. More guards posted, more spies sent into the city, more executions carried out against those who dared whisper of the cursed heirs. But fear cannot chain destiny. The twins, weak from birth, grew weaker still. Their bodies, never strong, faltered under the weight of sickness. Fevers came like storms, leaving them gasping. At times, they lay so still that even the queen feared. Their breath had left them, She clung to them desperately, praying, bargaining with gods she had once defied. One night, as the storm battered the palace once more, one of the twins fell silent forever. His frail chest no longer rose, his tiny hand no longer gripped his mother's finger. The queen's scream tore through the hidden halls, raw and broken, echoing louder than thunder. She cradled his lifeless body, her tears soaking his still face. The king entered, his jaw tight, his eyes dark. He looked upon the dead child, then at the one who remained, still alive, but trembling with sickness. His voice was cold, empty. One heir remains, that is enough. But even he could not hide the crack in his tone, the tremor in his hands. The queen buried her son in secret, within the palace gardens where roses grew thick and wild. No monument marked his grave, no prayers spoken aloud. Only a mother's tears watered the soil above him. The surviving twin lingered, weak and frail, a living shadow of his brother. His breath was shallow, his cries faint, his body consumed by illness. The queen never left his side, whispering love into ears that may never have understood. She prayed he would live, even as she knew deep inside that he would not. And so, weeks later, as dawn broke pale and grey, the second child slipped away. His tiny form lay still in his mother's arms, his eyes closed forever. This time the queen did not scream. She sat in silence, rocking his body gently, her face blank with grief, too deep for tears. When the king arrived, he found her still holding the child, her voice whispering broken words. "Both are gone. Our bloodline is broken." The king turned away, his face as stone. But when he reached the solitude of his chamber, the rage he had buried erupted. He smashed mirrors, shattered goblets, tore tapestries from the walls. He cursed the gods, cursed the priests, cursed the people who whispered of curses. Yet he never once cursed himself, for to admit fault was a burden his pride could not bear. But the queen knew. She carried the weight of guilt like chains upon her soul. She had defied nature, ignored the omens, silenced the warnings, and now her children, innocent, fragile, undeserving, had paid the price. The palace grew emptier still. The hidden wing was sealed once more, its halls abandoned, its windows forever closed. No cries echoed there now. Only silence, heavier than stone. Servants whispered that ghosts lingered in those chambers, the spirits of the cursed twins. Forever weeping for the sins of their parents, the queen withered, consumed by sorrow. Her eyes dimmed, her body weakened, her heart broken beyond repair. She lived only in memories, clutching scraps of cloth that had once wrapped her children, listening in the night for cries that would never come again. The king grew harder, colder, his paranoia turning him into a tyrant. He ruled with iron and blood, striking down even those who had once loved him. But no matter how he raged, no matter how many enemies he crushed, he could not silence the truth whispered by his people. The dynasty was cursed, the heirs were gone, and the throne, once invincible, was crumbling. The twins were meant to secure eternity. Instead, they became the symbols of ruin. Hidden in silence, lost in sorrow, they carried the weight of sins that were never theirs to bear. And as their tiny lives faded, so too did the dynasty that had traded love for power and blood for greed. The empire that had once stretched across mountains and rivers, whose banners had once cast shadows over nations, now lay in ruin. Its palaces, once shining with marble and gold, were cracked and broken. Its markets, once alive with music and color, stood silent. Its people, once bound by fear of their rulers, had cast off their chains. The dynasty that had seemed eternal had collapsed, not with the clash of swords alone, but with the weight of its own sins. The king, who had once proclaimed himself invincible, lived long enough to watch his empire shatter piece by piece. One by one, his generals betrayed him, his allies abandoned him, and his soldiers deserted. His throne, carved from stone and fire, stood empty more often than not. And though he roared and raged, though he spilled rivers of blood to hold on to power, his voice no longer commanded loyalty, for the people remembered. They remembered the forbidden union, the marriage that defied the laws of heaven and earth. They remembered the whispers of curses ignored, the warnings silenced, the priests cast aside. And most of all, they remembered the twins, the fragile children who were, not saviors but omens, the heirs who had died before they could rule, leaving behind only the memory of suffering and the echo of curses. The queen did not live to see the final collapse. Her grief consumed her, draining her spirit until her body followed. She was buried, quietly, with little ceremony, her name spoken in sorrow rather than reverence. To some, she was a victim of fate. To others, a sinner who had embraced greed. But to all, she was remembered as the mother of cursed heirs. The king remained, a hollow shadow of the man he had once been. Paranoia gnawed at him like a disease. He trusted no one, loved no one, ruled no one. His halls grew empty, his armies grew thin, and his throne grew cold. In the end, he sat alone in a palace that had become nothing more than a tomb for his dynasty. Outside the walls, rebels rose, victorious. New rulers claimed the land, their banners tearing down the old crest of the cursed bloodline. Statues of the siblings were toppled, their faces smashed into dust. Their names were struck from scrolls of glory, rewritten as warnings instead of triumphs. And so the once powerful dynasty did not pass into history as conquerors, but as a cautionary tale. Parents whispered it to their children, priests spoke it in their sermons, poets carved it into verse. They broke the laws of nature, the people said. They chose power over love, greed over wisdom, pride over humility. And in their blindness, they destroyed themselves. Generations passed, but the story lived on. Travelers spoke of the cursed rulers in hushed tones as they crossed the ruins of their palaces. Priests warned kings and queens not to repeat their mistakes. The tale became more than history. It became legend, and at the heart of that legend were not the victories, not the riches, not the empire that had once stood tall. At its heart were the twins, innocent lives lost, remembered not for who they were, but for what they symbolized. The curse of blood turned against itself, the cost of pride too great to bear. In the end, the dynasty achieved the immortality it craved, but not in the way it had dreamed. Its name lived forever, not in glory, but in infamy. It became a reminder carved into the soul of history that no throne stands forever, no bloodline remains pure, no power is worth the price of defiance against the natural order. The ruins of the empire still stand, silent and broken, their stones blackened by time. Travelers say that when the wind moves through the empty halls, it carries with it faint cries, the echoes of the cursed twins, their voices weeping for eternity. Some say the roses in the palace gardens bloom redder than any others, their roots drinking sorrow from the soil where the first child was buried. Others swear they have seen shadows in the shuttered windows, as though the dynasty's ghosts still wander, searching for the peace they were denied, but the living no longer fear them. Instead, they tell their story as a warning for kings who would place pride above wisdom, for queens who would choose greed over love, for dynasties who would dare to defy the balance of nature. And so it was that the mighty fell, not by sword or siege, but by their own hand. Their hunger for power blinded them, their pride destroyed them, and their blood betrayed them. The world remembers their names, not as rulers, but as warnings. For when power blinds the soul, even blood turns against blood.